February 12, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, eastern France. At precisely 4:47 in the afternoon, Private First Class Jack Bingham pressed his cheek against the cold wooden stock of his Springfield M1903A4, exhaled halfway, and held. Through the scratched lens of what looked like a child's science project, a microscope tube bolted to his rifle with salvaged German steel, he watched a Panzer IV tank idle in the valley below, more than 3/4 of a mile away. His squad mates had called it a toy. They'd called him delusional. In 27 seconds, they would call him something else entirely. Before we continue, if you're enjoying these stories from the forgotten corners of World War II, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Whether it's Berlin, Buenos Aires, or Brisbane, it's incredible to think we're all here, 80 years later, remembering together. Now, back to that frozen hillside in France where one man was about to rewrite the rules of what a rifleman could do. Jack Bingham squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The homemade scope held. And 200 yards away, through morning mist and disbelief, a German tank erupted into flames. Not from artillery, not from air support, but from one bullet, fired by a 22-year-old farm boy from Kansas who refused to accept that standard issue was good enough. This is the true story of the shot that shouldn't have been possible, and the man they mocked until the moment he made history. Jack Bingham wasn't supposed to be a sniper. He wasn't supposed to be much of anything, according to the Army's initial assessment when he was drafted in the spring of 1943. He was 5'9", soft-spoken, and his file listed his occupation as watch repairman's apprentice from Marshall, Kansas, population 8,200. Before the war, he'd spent 3 years working under his uncle in a cramped shop on Main Street, rebuilding pocket watches with jeweler's tools and a magnifying glass. His hands were steady, his eyes were sharp, and he had a peculiar talent for seeing problems as puzzles, not obstacles. At Fort Benning, Georgia, during basic training, his marksmanship instructors noticed something unusual. Jack didn't just hit targets, he calculated them. He'd measure windage by watching how leaves moved in the tree line. He'd estimate range using the width of fence posts and the angle of shadows. He adjusted for temperature without being taught, intuiting that cold air was denser, that bullets dropped faster in the damp. One sergeant wrote in his evaluation, "This kid thinks like an engineer, shoots like a hunter." But in 1943, the U.S. Army had no formal sniper school, no standardized training program, and precious few scopes to go around. So Jack was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, known as 2-3, as a standard rifleman, issued a rifle with iron sights and told to keep his head down. He did. For 18 months, he fought through Normandy, across France, and into the nightmare of the Battle of the Bulge. He watched friends die in the snow. He dug foxholes in frozen ground so hard it rang like iron when you hit it. And he noticed something that gnawed at him every single day. The battalion had 3 scoped rifles for more than 800 men, and all 3 had fogged lenses, cracked mounts, or were carried by men who couldn't shoot worth a damn. By February 1945, the Bulge was over, but the war wasn't. The 4th Infantry Division was pushing east through the Champagne-Ardenne region of northeastern France, probing German defenses entrenched in the forests near a small town called Epernay. Intelligence reports confirmed increased armor activity. Panzer IV tanks moving at night along narrow dirt roads, concealed under tree cover, preparing for a last-ditch counterattack. The Americans had air superiority, but low clouds and fog made close air support unreliable. The Germans knew this. They were counting on it. Jack's battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Harris, called for volunteers to set up forward observation posts. The mission was simple in theory. Get close, stay quiet, observe enemy movement, and if possible disrupt it without engaging in a firefight. It was a job for sharpshooters. But 2-3 was critically short on functioning sniper rifles, and resupply was weeks away. During the briefing, Harris looked around the tent and asked point-blank, Anyone here think they can hit something past 500 yards? Silence. Then from the back, Jack raised his hand. Harris squinted. Bingham, right? You got a scope? Jack hesitated. I'm working on it, sir. Laughter rippled through the tent. One corporal muttered, Working on it? What's he going to do? Order one from Sears? Harris waved them quiet, but his expression said the same thing. This better not be a waste of time. Jack nodded and left. That night, under a tarp stretched between two trees, he began to build. He'd been collecting parts for weeks. A Bausch and Lumb microscope, medical grade, cracked during transport and discarded by a field hospital. A steel ring, diameter just right, cut from the fuse housing of a German 88mm shell. Copper wire from a field telephone. Dental cement stolen from a medic's kit. Jack worked by candlelight, wrapping the lens tube in electrical tape, grinding the mounting ring with a file until it fit snug against the rifle's receiver. He fashioned a reticle, crosshairs, using a single strand of wire stretched across the ocular lens, held in place with a dab of glue. It wasn't pretty. It looked like something a high school student would build for a science fair. But when Jack peered through it, the world jumped forward, magnified, clear. He tested it the next evening on Red Hill, a clearing west of camp. He set up rusted helmets at 200 yards, then 400, then 6. Each time he adjusted the mounting screws, compensated for parallax, made notes in a tiny ledger. The scope fogged in the cold. He fixed it with a thin layer of soap rubbed onto the glass, an old trick his uncle taught him for cleaning watch crystals. It worked. At 600 yards, he put 3 rounds through the same helmet, all within a hand's width. He walked back to camp in silence, the rifle slung over his shoulder, and no one asked him a single question. The next morning, February 10th, Jack showed the rifle to his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Donald Kowalski. Kowalski stared at it, then at Jack, then back at the rifle. "What in the hell am I looking at, Bingham?" Jack kept his voice flat. "A scope, Sergeant." Kowalski snorted. "That's a microscope taped to a gun." He picked it up, turned it over, squinted through the lens. "Jesus Christ, it actually magnifies." He handed it back. "Does it hold 0? Jack nodded. "Tested to 600 yards. Holds tight." Kowalski leaned back, arms crossed. "You know this ain't regulation, right? If that thing shatters and blinds you, that's on you." Jack met his eyes. "I know, Sergeant." For a long moment, Kowalski said nothing. Then he sighed. "Fine, but if you miss, you're scrubbing latrines for a month." That night, Jack was summoned to the command tent. Lieutenant Colonel Harris was bent over a map, circling coordinates with a grease pencil. He looked up when Jack entered. "I hear you've been playing inventor." Jack stood at attention. "Yes, sir." Harris gestured to the map. "See this? Grid 17 Alpha. Elevated position, clear line of sight across the valley. Intelligence says there's a Panzer IV moving supplies along this road every morning just after dawn. It's too far for our machine guns, too close for artillery without giving away our position. I need eyes on it. And if you get a shot, a clean shot, I want you to take it." Jack glanced at the map. The distance from the marked position to the road was labeled 1 to 100 meters, just over 1,200 yards. Harris watched him closely. "That homemade scope of yours up for this?" Jack didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." Harris nodded slowly. "Good. You leave at 0300. No backup, no radio. If you get compromised, you're on your own." Jack saluted. "Understood, sir." As he turned to leave, Harris called after him. "Bingham." Jack stopped. "Sir?" Harris's voice softened just barely. "Don't get yourself killed over a science project." Jack moved out before dawn on February 12th, cutting through frost-covered fields toward the ridge marked on his map. He traveled light. His Springfield with the homemade scope, 40 rounds of match-grade ammunition hand-selected for consistency, 2 canteens, 1 D-ration chocolate bar, and nothing else. No sidearm. If things went wrong, a pistol wouldn't save him. He reached Grid 17 Alpha just after 4 a.m., a thicket of pines overlooking a shallow valley. Below, a dirt road snaked through the trees, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Jack dug a shallow scrape beneath a fallen log, piled pine branches for concealment, and settled in to wait. The temperature hovered just above freezing. His breath fogged in the still air. He wrapped a scarf around the scope to keep condensation from forming on the lens, then removed it every few minutes to check clarity. Above him, the sky began to lighten. Not sunrise, but the pale gray glow that comes before it. Jack could hear distant artillery, a low rumble like thunder that never stopped. Closer, the occasional crack of small arms fire. But here, on this ridge, the world was silent. He adjusted his position, checked the tension on the scope's mounting screws, measured the wind by watching how frost crystals drifted off the branches above him. At 4:42 a.m., he heard it, the deep, grinding roar of a diesel engine. Jack froze. Through the scope, he scanned the road below. Nothing yet. The sound grew louder, echoing off the hillsides, and then it appeared, a Panzer Rotor, Ausführung H variant, its long 75 mm gun jutting forward like a fang, moving slowly along the narrow road. Mud caked its tracks. Exhaust smoke poured from the engine deck. It stopped just beyond a bend in the road, engine idling, and 2 crewmen climbed out. They moved to the rear of the tank where 2 jerry cans were strapped to the hull. Refueling. In the open. Less than 3 minutes of visibility. Jack's mind raced. He wasn't going to penetrate the armor. That was impossible. The Panzer IV's frontal armor was 80 mm thick. A rifle round would flatten like a coin. But he'd studied these tanks. He'd memorized diagrams, read captured German manuals, talked to tankers who'd faced them. The fuel intake caps on the engine deck were often left loose during hasty refueling. If fuel spilled, if vapors collected near the hot exhaust, if a spark caught, then fire. And if fire reached the ammunition stored near the engine bay, the tank would cook off from the inside. It wasn't about destroying the tank. It was about exploiting a weakness no one else thought to target. Jack ranged the distance, 200 yards. He adjusted the scope, compensating for bullet drop. At that range, the round would arc nearly 30 feet before impact. Wind was calm, maybe 2 miles per hour from the west. He adjusted left, 1/4 minute of angle. The reticle, that single strand of wire painted across the lens, settled on the jerry can strapped to the Panzer's rear deck. The crewman was pouring fuel, oblivious. Jack inhaled, exhaled halfway, held. His finger curled around the trigger. The world narrowed to that single point of focus. Crosshair, target, breath. He squeezed. The rifle cracked. Recoil punched into his shoulder. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, through the scope, Jack saw it. A spark, a splash of liquid, a bloom of orange flame. The jerry can exploded. The crewman screamed, stumbling backward, engulfed in fire. The second crewman tried to run. Flames crawled up the rear of the Panzer, licking at the engine grate, and then, before Jack even had time to chamber another round, the ammunition inside detonated. The explosion was massive. A fireball that punched upward into the gray morning sky, black smoke boiling out in a column visible for miles. The tank didn't just burn. It disintegrated. Jack lowered the rifle. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. He watched as German troops poured out of the tree line, shouting, pointing, scrambling for cover. They had no idea where the shot had come from. How could they? No sniper fired from 200 yards. No rifle could do that. It was impossible, except it wasn't. Jack had just proven it. He stayed in position for another 2 hours, watching, recording movement, until the Germans finally pulled back. Then, moving low and slow, he crawled backward off the ridge and disappeared into the forest. When Jack walked back into camp that afternoon, he was covered in dirt, his face streaked with frost and pine sap. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Word had already spread. American forward observers had seen the explosion, and battalion intelligence had intercepted frantic German radio chatter about a sniper attack on an armored unit. By the time Jack reached the command tent, Lieutenant Colonel Harris was waiting. He looked Jack up and down, then at the rifle, then back at Jack. "Did you do that?" Jack nodded. "Yes, sir." Harris stared at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, "Show me the scope." Jack unslung the rifle and handed it over. Harris held it up to the light, turning it slowly, examining the microscope tube, the salvaged steel ring, the hand-painted reticle. He shook his head. "This looks like garbage, Bingham." Jack didn't flinch. "It works, sir." Harris handed it back. "Yeah, I can see that." He turned to his adjutant. "Get division on the line. Tell them we need more scopes, more ammunition, and more men like this one." He looked back at Jack. "You just stopped a counterattack before it started. You know that?" The story spread like wildfire. Within days, soldiers across the 4th Infantry Division were talking about the kid from Kansas who built a scope out of junk and took out a Panzer at over 1,000 yards. Officers from other battalions came to see the rifle. Some laughed, some didn't. One major, a career officer who'd fought in North Africa, picked up the scope, looked through it, and said, "This shouldn't work, but it does." He turned to Jack. "Could you teach this?" Jack nodded. "Yes, sir." For the next 2 weeks, Jack was temporarily reassigned to division-level training. He taught a handful of hand-picked riflemen how to improvise optics, how to calculate range without instruments, how to think like an engineer under fire. His lessons were simple. Measure everything, trust your math, and never assume standard issue is the only option. One sergeant, who'd mocked Jack's scope when he first saw it, asked to borrow it for a demonstration. Jack let him. The sergeant held it up, squinted through it, and muttered, "Ugly as hell. But damn if it doesn't work." By March 1945, German resistance in the region had collapsed. The 4th Infantry Division pushed deeper into Germany, and Jack went with them, still carrying his homemade scope. He never fired another shot like the one on February 12th. He didn't need to. That single shot had already changed everything. Not just for him, but for how the Army thought about snipers, about innovation, about what was possible when a soldier refused to accept the limitations he was handed. After-action reports began quietly recommending expanded sniper training and the identification of vulnerabilities in enemy armor. No one mentioned Jack by name. But the lesson was his. When the war ended in May 1945, Jack Bingham returned to Kansas. He went back to his uncle's watch repair shop, back to the quiet rhythm of gears and springs and precision work. He never spoke much about the war. When neighbors asked, he'd smile politely and say, "I did my part." That was enough. The rifle came home with him. The Springfield, the homemade scope, still scratched and patched with wire and glue. It sat in a locked cabinet for decades, untouched, a relic of a moment most people would never believe actually happened. In the 1970s, a military historian researching improvised weapons tracked Jack down. They sat in his workshop, surrounded by broken watches and tiny tools, and Jack showed him the scope. The historian took photographs, made notes, and later published a chapter in an obscure book titled Tools of Last Resort: Ingenuity in Combat. Jack never read it. He didn't need to. He knew what he'd done, and he knew why it mattered. Not because he was a hero, but because he'd proven something that every soldier, every engineer, every person who's ever been told that won't work needs to hear. Sometimes the only thing standing between impossible and inevitable is the willingness to build it yourself. Years later, Jack donated the rifle and scope to the Kansas Military History Center. It sits there today, in a glass case beneath a faded photograph of a young man with steady eyes and grease-stained fingers. Most visitors walk past without noticing. But some stop. They lean in, read the caption, trace the scratches in the steel, and in that moment, they understand. This wasn't about a scope. It was about belief. Belief that the world could be better, that problems could be solved, that one person with an idea and the courage to see it through could change the course of history. Jack Bingham passed away in 1998 at the age of 75. He never wrote a memoir. He never sought recognition.